the recovery taught me that you always have a choice to do one small thing. Working towards Everest was exactly the same. You start from nothing. You've got this, feels like an impossible challenge ahead, but you just break it down and you trust that the small things will make a difference.
G'day, and welcome to Wellbeing. I'm Jack Hodgins. Today we are talking with Bonita Norris about her journey with bulimia. At the time in 2010, at the age of 22, Bonita was the youngest British woman to have climbed Mount Everest. But it is her bulimia that she suffered through her teenage years that we will be talking about today. She touches on her journey with bulimia in her 2017 book, The Girl Who Climbed Everest. And as we will soon talk about, her bulimia was a mountain in itself. Hello Bonita, and welcome to Wellbeing.
Hi Jack, thanks for having me on.
We have to start at Mount Everest, I reckon, Bonita. So in 2010, you became the youngest British woman to climb Mount Everest. Yeah, take me through that.
It was quite a surprise because I'd only started climbing 2 years earlier when I was 20 years old, and I was 22 when I reached the top of Everest. And must say it was mostly due to having great support and a great team rather than my exceptional climbing abilities.
Yeah, and I mean, and of course you wrote a book about the girl who climbed Everest. Can you tell me how that kind of came to be? Because you've climbed this mountain, and then did you always set out to kind of write a book? Did it just kind of just happen?
When I got back from Everest, definitely people were asking, when's the book coming out? Because it's just not that common, I think. Well, it wasn't back in 2010 that a young woman would just out of nowhere wake up one day and decide to climb the world's highest mountain. But for me, Everest was just half of the story. On the way down from the summit, I had quite a bad fall and kind of came away from the mountain alive and having reached the summit and very successful in that regard, but also feeling like at the same time I failed. And so when people asked me about writing the book, I was like, yeah, no one wants to read a book about someone who fell off Everest. But time went on and I continued climbing and processed what happened. I thought, no, that's exactly what people would love to read about, because it's boring when people are just successful and it all goes well and there's no problems. The story really was in the success and the failure, and then turning that failure back into something that drove me into the mountains even more to do harder climbs. And so that's what the book was about in the end.
And I mean, what does it feel like to be on the top of Mount Everest? That's got to be a pretty cool feeling.
We were there for 10 or 15 minutes, and I must say it was the biggest relief just to have a rest and to know that it was all going to be downhill from that point. But after that very kind of basic sensation of just oh, thank God. Then, yeah, the problem when you're up there, for me on Everest anyway, was that you are so exhausted, oxygen deprived, that you can't actually process it in the moment. So I remember being almost hallucinating, thinking that I was on top of Mount Snowdon in Wales, which is the highest mountain in Wales in the UK, not on Everest at all. And I've heard other people say things like they thought they were queuing for a bus when they got to the top of Everest, and that's mainly just because your brain is starved of oxygen. So going through all of that was slightly odd, but then the real feeling of elation was just in getting to see the curvature of the earth. That was beautiful. Knowing that there had been so much unknown, so much risk and worry about whether this would ever happen. I felt like the whole 2 years that I was working towards this goal, it was like following a gut instinct that didn't really make any sense. And so to actually get there and realize that gut instinct, I was right to follow in it, that was a really lovely feeling to know that I trusted my instinct and it paid off.
You've climbed this big mountain, and you mentioned in your book your journey with bulimia, and was that a mountain in your life?
Yes, it was. It was definitely, and I felt very passionately that I wanted to write about my mental health as a teenager and my eating disorder, because I got the sense that there are so many others going through it in silence, and I just wanted to make it easier for people to talk about and normalize it in some ways. I found from recovering from my eating disorder, or at least, I think you spend your life in recovery from it, but the recovery taught me that you always have a choice to do one small thing. And working towards Everest was exactly the same. You start from nothing. You've got this, feels like an impossible challenge ahead, but you just break it down and you trust that the small things will make a difference. And they did.
I mean, would you say that climbing Mount Everest was a big part of that recovery kind of journey for you with bulimia?
Not consciously. With many years gone by, I reflect on it and I think maybe there was definitely an element of almost rebellion against that time of illness, because when you are really sick like that, you aren't using your body to do amazing things, and you feel very disconnected from what you're capable of. And so I think for me, getting into climbing and other outdoor activities like running, it was just about falling back in love with what I could do if I looked after myself. And yes, so I think in hindsight, probably there was an element of it. But at the time, if you'd have asked me, I would have said, no. Like, eating disorder was when I was a teenager. I'm a grown up now. And, life feels so huge back then, but it sort of condenses when you look back from mid-30s.
Like, from your perspective, is it something like when you have it, do you kind of lose that sense of who you are with it? Is it kind of like that?
Absolutely. I think that's a really good way of putting it, because you find yourself consumed by what I described as a parasite, really, in my head that had control over me. And you don't know what you want anymore, because you're only ever guided by what it wants, which is this cycle of binging and purging and obsessive thoughts and things like that. So absolutely, one of the greatest joys of coming out the other side of it was just actually realizing that it wasn't that voice, that parasite wasn't actually me, and there was this real me. So it was great to come out the other side.
And I mean, it sounds like when you kind of started mountain climbing, that in that kind of activity, you kind of started to find yourself again. Would you describe it like that?
Absolutely. I think I met myself on the top of some of the mountains that I've climbed, in the sense that there's so much shame when you have an eating disorder and you're going through it and you can't tell anyone, or you feel like you can't tell anyone. And for me, there was also a lot of shame around falling off Everest. That's how I describe it anyway. So in the end, sort of the end of my book, I describe a really good climb that we had in the Himalayas on the world's fourth highest peak, called Mount Lhotse. And it was a really tough climb, and I kind of got to the top and just felt for the first time I was meeting myself, in the sense that this is what I was always capable of. It was just a matter of breaking away from all the things that didn't serve me and focusing on what I could do. And yes, I think the mountains are just such a great teacher, and they do strip everything back.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned that you started experiencing that bulimia in your adolescence. Like, what kind of brings that on for someone so young?
I think it started when I was about 15, and it was a pendulum swing, really, from the other end of the eating disorder spectrum, which was just trying to starve myself, going down that route of, I was never anorexic, but I definitely had huge issues and would restrict food to the point of feeling very faint. And then it gets to a point where you can't cope with that any longer, and you go the other way and binge eat, and the feelings of guilt and shame that accompany that often then lead to making yourself sick. And it's really important. When I started talking, especially in the media, about my eating disorder, journalists would often ask me, do you have any pictures of you when you were really skinny then and you were really sick? And firstly, that's just awful, but that used to happen. I remember seeing those magazine articles when I was younger. It was sort of clickbait, if you like, before the internet. But the thing is, when you have an eating disorder, many people have eating disorders, they look on the outside at a normal weight, or they don't look very ill. And it's just so important to know that it's something that's going on in your head. And just because you don't look particularly underweight, it doesn't mean that you're not really sick. And I think that's really important. A lot of people don't understand. Have
you seen the media get better at how they approach eating disorders?
I think so, yes. You've got to remember that this was, more than 12 years ago. But for sure, growing up, reading teenage magazines, there would be the occasional article about a girl with anorexia, and their photos would be there of her weighing few stone on death's door. And I can't believe today that those were printed in teenage magazines. Obviously they were as a warning at the time, but I found them like, wow, God, I'm not that thin. It was a comparison. And most girls, I hope, would look at that and see that that person was very ill, but there are always going to be a few that don't. And I was one of them, unfortunately. So I do think it's changed a lot, and we can't use today's metrics of what's acceptable on the past, but I really do hope it's changed.
You're listening to Wellbeing, a nationally distributed radio show and podcast. My guest today is Mount Everest climber Bonita Norris, where we are discussing her journey with bulimia.
Taking you back to that mindset when you were 15, I mean, did you feel pressure like to look a certain way? Was that kind of the catalyst for it?
Well, it was around the early 2000s, which I think for many people now in their mid-30s, we look back on that time in the early 2000s and realize just how messed up it was, because size zero, that celebrity culture, those weekly celebrity magazines, which had like the circle of shame, would highlight, celebrities with rolls of fat coming over their jeans. That's the skin, not fat, And it was all about size zero. It was just unfortunately a time when that celebrity culture was really at its peak. And it was before social media, and I do think while social media has obviously exacerbated problems around disordered eating in some ways, in other ways it's allowed women to open up and say, God, how messed up was that? How messed up is it that, these women in the public eye are getting shamed because they don't conform to a certain look? And there was none of that ability when I was a teenager to kind of take a step back and share with other people, like, is this right? You just accepted it and thought success. It doesn't matter how successful these movie stars or singers, if they're not size zero, then these magazines are going after them. And so it gave me the sense that success was to be thin. And that's a really sad thing for a teenage girl to kind of come to the conclusion of. And I think that's really what kicked it off.
You mentioned before that the bulimia kind of led you to kind of lose yourself almost, and I'm thinking like as a young girl, I mean, how did that, like, I could imagine that would have affected you like in your daily life a lot if you're kind of losing your sense of self, like in how you kind of interact with your family, your friends. I mean, did it have a really big like impact on you on your daily life, beyond just, the binging and purging kind of thing?
Absolutely. You become at first quite secretive, and also very irritable and angry because of the helplessness that you're going through. This is an uncontrollable situation that you're going through privately. And so I was very hard to be around, I think. I was too proud or stubborn to tell my loved ones. Just didn't know how I could possibly broach such a conversation. And I just thought it'd be better to just pretend that it wasn't happening. So that was that side. And then just in terms of my life as a teenager, I was really tired all the time. I hated school. Like, I didn't learn anything, it felt like, for a really long time because I couldn't concentrate in class. I was also obviously very unfit. And I just think that when you have an eating disorder, your entire life is revolved around when you can eat, when you're not going to eat, what you're going to eat, so your social life is affected. It really does leach into every part of your life. And at the beginning, when you start, I remember the first time I made myself sick, I thought I had found the secret, like, this is amazing. I can eat what I like. I can live my life. And I just go to the bathroom afterwards. Thank goodness I found out how, I can do this. But the reality is that is just a trap. And you think you're in control until suddenly you realize that you're not. And then you can't escape. To anyone that has ever had those thoughts of, wouldn't it be so easy after I've had a big meal or something, if you get that feeling, that I still get that feeling, but I know that it's a trap, and that whilst tonight I think, it's nothing, I know that in a few weeks or a few months it would have taken over my life and I'll be completely out of control. So yeah, it's just not worth it. It's a lie. It doesn't solve any problems at all.
For those that even like are just thinking about it, like just thinking, like you mentioned there, like just having that thought after having a big meal, just, I could just go and kind of, chuck it up kind of thing. I mean, like for those that are kind of thinking like that, haven't, yet done it, I mean, do you think it's worthwhile for them to talk to someone about that even before they've kind of started doing it? Because I think it sounds like it's better for them to talk about those feelings now than, down the track when they're kind of really in with the bulimia.
I think it's always good to talk, but I also understand and appreciate that some people would find it really hard to talk about those feelings and actually to get the support that they need, because as a society, I'm in the UK, we aren't very good, or we weren't, I think things are changing, but we're not very good at talking about mental health. And, it's a lot of thing here is like stiff upper lip, or, kind of, you'll be all right. Almost just taking things lightly, not trying to dwell on things too much. And I've obviously dealt with my eating disorder for decades now. As I said, I still get those feelings. I don't think they'll ever, maybe they will. I'd love them to go away, but they're there, and I accept that they're there. But for me, I'm also I have so much other richness in my life, my family, my hobbies. There's so much worth living for that I kind of am able to put the moment into perspective. And so I would say to anyone struggling, it's what else is going on in your life? Because if you are getting those thoughts, then maybe there's something else that you need to address. And if it's loneliness or if it's pressure at work or whatever it is, just try and work out, what's going on and how to fill your life with so much joy and things that you love to do. That something like doing that to yourself, going to the bathroom to chuck up your dinner, just seems ridiculous, which is how I feel now. And you have to get to that point where you really enjoy your life, and that's what I mean about taking a small step. It's just about knowing that there's always a better thing out there to do. It's just my unprofessional advice. I'm not a therapist.
Yeah, those are some really, really good points. And how can say the friends or the parents of someone that's going through bulimia, I mean, how do we bring up that kind of conversation? Because I know you mentioned it's not everyone's kind of, and understandably so, keen to necessarily talk about it. So as friends and family of people going through this, I mean, how do we approach that conversation? And when's the best time? And how do we go about that, Bonita?
I wish I knew the answer. I think I would have just loved someone maybe at the time to have just been able to say, come on, let's get you out of your head somehow. Let's go and do something. And because often you get trapped in these cycles of being really stuck in your head, and you get home from school or work, whatever it is, and you've got these hours that you fill with binging, purging. I think I would have really appreciated somebody at the time to have just been able to get me away from that. And then eventually when you have that space and that distance from it, that's what then gives you the sense of strength that, that doesn't feel so close now. I can see that was really bad behavior. Had time away from it. It's like any addiction. Like you quit smoking, and the first few days are going to be the hardest, but as the weeks and the months go by, you need that cigarette less and less. So I think just a part of it is just having someone to just take you out of the situation. You don't have to have a therapy session, but someone who'll just be with you and be by your side, and whether you just watch Netflix together, or you go for a walk, or you do something, but just someone there, let the person who's suffering talk when they're ready, because I found talking the hardest thing. And if anyone kind of confronted me, then I would just shut down and flat deny it. Yeah. And I think when I was ready to talk, I wanted to talk, but I needed to feel safe and trusted, and it wasn't going to start an argument.
When it comes to how society views body shape or size, I mean, it sounds like we kind of need to shift that focus away from thinness a lot, because it sounds like even today, I mean, I think it's gotten a bit better, but it's still, we still have a lot of stigma, towards, everyone, it's better to be thin, there's still that mindset there. I mean, how can we go about that? How can we improve that stigma?
I think social media is a blessing and a curse for it. It depends on the influencers and the role models that young people, especially who are, young. I think young people are more. I was more easily influenced when I was younger, and so I think if you're a young person online and you find yourself following accounts that glorify a certain body shape, then you are, I think, opening the door to low self-esteem, and I think you've got to curate your social media and make sure that you're following accounts that are all about body positivity and celebrating the human body for what it is and not what how it looks. I think that's one place to start. But in terms of the stigma, I mean, I just think it exists, and it's really frustrating. And I think getting angry at it is a good thing. Just when you kind of see it, call it out in your mind or whatever, because there's an element of it being based, especially towards women anyway, and a certain amount of misogyny, I think, and just putting two fingers up to that in your mind. You don't have to say anything out loud, but really getting angry when you see these kind of messages about summer beach bodies and are you summer body ready? Like, no, like, go away. How dare you get angry at that stuff? Don't think, oh, I need a summer body, because it's going to be the diet cell. The diet industry is huge, and unfortunately, as long as it can peddle this idea of thinness meaning a better life, then it will sell diet products. People think that they're going to be happier when they're slimmer, and that is a perfectly reasonable thing to think, because I've thought that. But the truth is that what it can do is turn into a toxic disorder, and it's really hard to know when you stepped over that line. So just live your life and enjoy food and enjoy your body. But yeah, I think it's just about us personally, just in our own head saying no, like that stigma exists, but just no, that is wrong. And
You're listening to Wellbeing, a nationally distributed radio show and podcast. My guest today is Mount Everest climber Bonita Norris, where we are discussing her journey with bulimia.
What was the moment when you kind of put up your hand and said, it's time to get help with the bulimia?
There was a big gap of maybe 5 years between starting my recovery from my eating disorder and getting to Everest. So I didn't, as I said, 5 years when you're a teenager is a lifetime. So I didn't feel like they were connected. But for me, putting my hand up and asking for help came when I was 17. I just felt like I was at rock bottom. I couldn't get through the day anymore because this cycle of binging and purging was just quite overwhelming at that point. And at that point, you reach out for help. You think, I can't do this alone. I can't help myself anymore. And I went to my doctor, my GP. Here in the UK, we call them GPs. And they said, oh, we can put you on a waiting list for group therapy. The waiting list is 6 months. I thought, I can't. 6 months, when you ask for help, you need it today. And I went home and I found details of a private doctor, and I emailed, pouring my heart out. I needed help, and I got a response. It was 2 lines, like, yeah, we can see you at £200. We're 150 miles from where you live. So it was just, that's when it all sort of came crashing down. And I thought, hang on, I did the thing that we're always told to do, which is to ask for help. And when I did, there was no help. At that point, I felt like obviously the best thing would have been to have spoken to my family, someone that could have helped me in that regard. But as I said, I didn't have the first clue how to be that vulnerable with them. And that would have been the brave thing, but I wasn't brave. I just ended up that day when I was 17, just going for I know this sounds ridiculous, but I just remember in frustration at the whole situation, getting on my dad's old dusty treadmill in the back of his study and putting it onto a sprint and just like getting on and running as fast as I could, because I just didn't know what else to do. And I just remember thinking, I've got to do something that's not eating or making myself sick. And I ran for about 46 seconds or something. But at the end of that run, it felt like everything had changed suddenly in terms of just my sense of taking back power and like, okay, I can make decisions. I don't have to listen to that voice. I just went for a run, even though it was 46 seconds. It felt very empowering.
Yeah.
And that was the start of going, I can do stuff for me. And that was the realization of like, I can actually fill my life with things that are good for me and that I love. Because I used to love running as a kid, and I quit when I got to secondary school. But I went back the next day from that first treadmill run, and I was on the treadmill and I ran for a minute or a minute and a half. The next day it was 5 minutes, and then it was 10. And I just started filling my days with thinking about like I couldn't wait to get on and go for a run when I got home from school. And I just loved connecting with my body. And people often say, oh, you can go from having an eating disorder to having an exercise obsession. I'm really aware of that, but I don't know if that's what I had, because I was definitely not like an obsessive. I wasn't getting up early and training all day and stuff. I just loved going out for a little half an hour run after school and clearing my head. And it just felt like the most wonderful thing after years of just beating myself up. So I think it was that moment on that treadmill that day at my rock bottom that I realized I can actually make a choice to do something that feels really good.
Yeah.
And and that was the start of the recovery. And I'm really thankful that was the start of a real upward trajectory of getting better. And it has, I've had relapses over the years, of course, but it was such a mindset change that really any time I've relapsed, I've always tried to come back to finding that joy again. And that's what's gotten me out of it. But in terms of professional help, as I said, I'm not a therapist. I've never even had therapy, which is why I'm aware of what I'm saying. People listening, I'm not an expert and I haven't had any professional help with this. It's just my experience. So it's all very personal and everyone's different, but this is what works for me.
How do you make sure in yourself that now that doesn't happen? Is there, do you have any mental strategies? What do you do?
Being really mindful and aware of the triggers, I think, is the most important thing. Triggers can be as simple as not having certain foods around or not ever eating certain foods that would often in the past have triggered a kind of binge. So that's really basic stuff. The other more nuanced stuff is just knowing in my life what's going on. So if I have a holiday, a vacation booked, those kind of thoughts around you need to, you're going to have your beach body, whether I like it or not, they come up. If I don't notice those thoughts, I find that those thoughts turn into, why don't you just go and do that thing that you can do? And in the past, I've fallen into that trap, and that's a relapse. So now, whenever I have, I feel like the pressure to look a certain way, something's coming up, I'm very mindful of it, and I can see it's coming, and that means that I can just immediately take a step back from it and say, that's a load of rubbish, and it doesn't lead anywhere good. Who cares if you're what you look like? Because, and it's simple things. I mean, the scales, I never weigh myself, ever. And I follow lots of really body positive accounts on social media that make me feel great, because they're like, let's just live our lives and be happy. We don't have to live a certain way, look a certain way, so when you need a pick me up, that's great. And I also just am inspired by amazing role models in the mountains and in the public eye who inspire me. And the last thing they inspire me for is because of the way they look. It's about what they're doing in the world. And so it's all of those things together that kind of help me through. But it's just those triggers, whether it's having the scales out, having certain foods around, having an event coming up, or just feeling really stressed again. And it's being really mindful of knowing the triggers and filling your life with things that give you perspective, whether that's a social media account or it's a hobby that you love, or as I mentioned, role models. And that's what works for me.
Yeah, and look, I mean, fantastic points again, and I think we've gotten so much that we've talked about, Bonita, in this interview that I think is just really helpful. And so, I mean, where can we get your book, The Girl Who Climbed Everest? Where is it available?
Oh, it's available in all good bookstores, I'd like to think. The reality is I go into bookshops all the time looking for it, and it's hardly ever there. So I would say, but just Googling, putting it in to your search engine, The Girl Who Climbed Everest, and online you'll be able to buy a copy. And my name's Bonita Norris, and because I think there's maybe more than one book with that title. So
yeah,
buy my one.
Thanks for making the time, Bonita. It's I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you so much, Jack. It was a real pleasure talking. And I would say the last caveat, please always talk to professionals. I'm not professional myself or an expert. And I hope me talking makes people feel less alone in what they're going through. But it's just my personal experience at the end of the day.
My guest today was Bonita Norris, a Mount Everest climber with a bulimia journey. And if you like this content, check out the Wellbeing podcast for more. Thank you for listening. I'm Jack Hodgins, and all of us at Wellbeing wish you well.